Welcome to the Think Forward podcast, where we speak with futurists, innovators, and big thinkers. Come along with your host, Steve Fisher, and explore the future together.
Welcome, friends and fellow big thinkers. In this episode, I have the privilege of speaking with someone who has spent decades navigating the complex and ever-evolving world of defense strategy and foresight. Our guest is a highly respected expert in strategic foresight who has dedicated over 20 years to shaping the future of national security. From his career as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force to his current role as Executive Director of Global Foresight at Phaedrus Engineering, he brings invaluable insights into defense strategy. We'll explore his work on threatcasting, a method for predicting future threats, and discuss how foresight plays a crucial role in addressing U.S.-China competition, technological disruptions, and global geopolitical shifts. He'll also share insights from his new book, The Revenge of Ideology, examining how ideologies shape national decisions. This conversation will offer valuable lessons, not only for those in the defense sector, but also for leaders across industries who are looking to integrate foresight into their strategic planning. If you're interested in how the future of defense and geopolitics might unfold and what you can do to stay ahead, this episode is for you. Welcome to episode 111, The Future of Defense with Dr. Jake Sotiriadis. Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Great to be here.
So Jake, you and I were talking before the recording here, and you've been on this journey for a long time. I think those who are on LinkedIn, you're very prolific. So many may know you in the field, but for those that don't, could you share your background and how you became futures fluent, if you will, and got into the field?
Sure, absolutely. So it's kind of an interesting story, but the long and short of it is I've been in the national security space, specifically the Defense Department, the Air Force, the intelligence community for the last 21 years. So that's been the main thrust of my efforts, has been trying to build futures literacy, use strategic foresight to help the United States, help our national security strategy. And then in my last position before I retired from active service last month, also in the academic world as the director of the Center for Futures Intelligence at the National Intelligence University. So it's been a really fun journey. Now I think I have the best job in the world being the executive director of global foresight and strategy at a firm called Phaedrus Engineering, which is based in Columbia, Maryland, where we're looking at systems engineering, but bringing foresight and systems engineering together for not only government partners, but private sector clients as well. So it's come full circle.
That's great. I know that your academic background's in political science, international relations. How does that influence your approach to foresight and what you do as a futurist?
Well, Steve, to be honest, I've often felt that what I really do is strategy. I've always considered myself a strategist, and I use foresight essentially to inform better strategy, to help us develop an anticipatory mindset. And so really as an international relations guy, somebody who's looked really hard at geopolitics, how the world hangs together, understanding those kinds of theories, that's really where foresight to me helps us look beyond sort of the expected outcomes and gives us that capacity to do some really deep thinking, but not just what's coming out in the news, these deep-seated issues of geopolitical transformation, global politics, and then you overlay the technological developments, the scientific developments, the societal developments. So it's this holistic view that I think foresight allows you to employ, which really is, there's no substitute for it.
So where did your interest kind of start? Like, where did it spark? Like, where everyone seems to have a story, somewhere in their life, they found this kind of field and this discipline. Where was it for you?
And for me, it was really in graduate school when I had the opportunity to go for an Air Force sponsored PhD to the University of Hawaii academic program for foresight in the United States that was started by Jim Dater. So I feel like it was just a foundational opportunity for me. And then there was just a perfect combination because I had already been an intelligence officer in the Air Force for about 15 years. So I had been doing a lot of these things, just not knowing what I was doing was perhaps foresight. Getting into the academic piece of it really gave me, I think, the other half of the equation And it just jump-started this interest. And then when I could see the application of how I would be able to put to work in the intelligence community of the DoD and now in industry, it just, the light came on for me.
So when you mentioned national security, so what do you find is most effective? And before I have you answer that question, Foresight really in modern futurism became future studies and futures work came from the defense industry and wargaming, Rand Corporation, things in the 50s for dealing with nuclear war. Fast forwarding to today with national security and defense, what do you find is most effective when doing this type of work with them?
Let me just start off by saying that I think there's a bit of a misnomer when we talk about futurists today, because if you look after the pandemic, there's been a surge of interest, which on the one hand is a good thing. If you would have looked on LinkedIn, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, and you put in the word future, you probably wouldn't find very many people. Now that's the complete opposite. But we may have a different problem now because, in my opinion, I think doing this work means that you've got some deep expertise somewhere, right? So, for example, I'm a national security expert, geopolitics, intelligence. I've got some other friends in the space who are economists, who are tech experts, these kinds of things. So I think it's important to ground oneself in some deep expertise, because then you're able to overlay the Foresight methodology to really get after some wicked problems. I think for the national security space right now, where Foresight really helps us iterate is this realization of the complexity of the world that we're living in today. And it's not just the fact that we have this US-China competition, that we have new ideological models, that we have this technological breakthrough, which is going to transform how wars are fought in the future, surveillance, all of these kinds of issues. So I think against that backdrop, the linear way of thinking of let's just go from point A to point B to point C and then reevaluate, we're going to come up short doing that.
So in your writings, you've talked about the concept of threatcasting. Can you share an explanation of that? Because you talk about the evolution, how we apply that, and different people have come at the field with different expertise, but yours specifically, so we're good grounded in that concept. Where and when is it useful? What is it about?
Yeah, threatcasting is a methodology that was developed by my colleagues, Brian David Johnson and Cindy Kuhn out at Arizona State University. And it's something that we are using at Phaedrus to be able to combine data, trends, and expert insights to be able to basically envision future threats and opportunities. So where a lot of Foresight work ends up doing what I call left of scenarios. So a lot of trend analysis, a lot of horizon scanning, a lot of that kind of work, just filling up how we got here, historical sources of disruption, which is all really important. And where threatcasting really helps us differentiate is that we're able to blend the quantitative and the qualitative data that we're able to get from an audience, in some cases in real time, use things like speculative storytelling. And it doesn't just predict one solitary future. It's looking at multiple possible futures. And then we're looking at winners and losers in each of these scenarios. And it's also very multidisciplinary, because we're bringing experts with a wide range of portfolios to the table so that it can inform the overall outcome of our exercise or study.
That's a great explanation. With the work, and you talked about Phaedrus and linking systems engineering with futures and Foresight, does that systemically impact things like geopolitical work as well? Because you think about the systems of defense, right? The systems of how we defend and how we coordinate work. Because warfare's changed. How would you make the connection to support the work that you do? Like, how does that work together? And then we'll talk about some of the geopolitical parts of this, but how it applies.
So let me talk first about how we're employing threatcasting at Phaedrus. Yeah, absolutely. So at Phaedrus, we have a broader Foresight portfolio, and that addresses different focus areas depending on our clients. We've got clients in the national security space, but also private sector clients, which I think is a really important differentiator. There are lessons, important techniques, and important tradecraft that we can uniquely tailor to each one of these clients depending on their particular focus area. We're able to do with threatcasting as one tool in our toolkit is to help organizations identify off the radar risks. So help them build resilience against unforeseen disruptions, and then hopefully craft strategic plans that are agile and adaptable. So we're giving them a proactive type approach rather than just waiting for something to happen. And we're actually trying to get them into this idea of turning uncertainty into a strategic advantage and not looking at ambiguity as a liability. We want them to be able to actively shape those aspirational futures. And that's where this has applications into concept development, time to market. So it's not all just about profitability. It's really the whole systems engineering cycle. So I think that is a very unique way of us bringing this strategic model to the table. To the second part of your question about geopolitics, Steve, it's September 11th today. So it's hard to believe 23 years ago. Yeah, here we are 23 years ago, right? This country went through such a horrific experience, and it was something that shaped my life very profoundly. And I'm sure many of the folks who are listening and watching today as well. And let's be very honest, the United States didn't really do a great job of the post 9/11 foreign policy strategy, global strategy, right? We tried to turn what was essentially a manhunt operation into a strategy, right? Which we saw come up really short. We saw us not employ this kind of anticipatory mentality, which is where we ended up with being surprised by the Arab Spring, the rise of populism, the worst pandemic since 1917. And now we're sitting in the middle of biggest conflict in Europe since 1945. So I think all of those things I just laid out there, I think should be a wake-up call that the status quo doesn't work, that we've got to have a better way of doing business and crafting the strategy.
Cyclically, yeah, I'm a cycles theorist as a futurist. So I look at pattern, and we're coming to the end of a cycle. You can call it the fourth turning. You can call it a couple different versions out there. I have my own theory of macro history. So I see the institutions that have been around for 70 years, the trust is eroded. And people who are still in power, the older age group are desperately trying to stay around and desperately trying to keep what's there. And it's crumbling. It's going to shift so much of the world. BRICS might completely take the dollar as the petrodollar off the table. And that would be perilous for the United States economy. And when economies go bad, that's when civil unrest is usually most palpable, right? When people are sitting around at home. And your assessment of things, I agree with you. And we all have our own stories, and we all know where we were, and we're not to get into the personal side of that's for this podcast. But we're taping, it's 10:30 right now. At this point, the first tower has fallen. And I remember talking to my father. We woke up because nobody could get on the internet. We had to go up and watch TVs in a bar. And we walked up from work, and it was like Pearl Harbor. Again, you just didn't know. It's just this systemic shock of change, and you thought things were at peace for a long time. And to your point, I'm very patriotic. I'm very pro-Constitution, but I've become more anti-war in that way because of the way we handle things. I agree with your assessment. And it makes me think as a futurist, like when you talk with clients and you're exploring things, what do you believe are future conflicts? Like, how do you talk about future conflicts and what they'll look like?
So when we talk about future conflicts with clients or just as a conceptual framework, I think it's really important to give people a way of thinking about what the global strategic environment will look like first. And then they can drill down from that 50,000-foot level. It's really sexy and cool and exciting to talk about all the new technological gadgets that we're going to have and tools. And that's a part of it. But we have to also remind ourselves that sometimes things like ideas still matter, and they're going to matter into the future. So we can't just say, for example, the Cold War is over and ideology is dead, because guess what? That was not a good surprise for us. History didn't end. It's still very much alive. And we're sitting here in the middle of what I would call a renewed multipolar competition. And we've got the same people who led us into the catastrophic results of the last 2 decades telling us about the way ahead. And so it fascinates me that people who have a track record of policy failure just keep getting up to bat again and again. So clearly we need to do things differently. The challenge of our time, I think, is the US-China competition. We need to continue looking at that, but not just through a material or hard power way of thinking. We've got to look at multiple lenses of this competition, which is all encompassing. It's not just a military problem. I would argue it's far bigger than that. So we got to figure out how we can reinvent the idea of American deterrence, right? In the wake of all of these negative policy actions that have eroded the United States leadership role in the world. And we can see the results of that, which is the fact that we have all of this global chaos. Foresight has to be at the center of all of it if we're going to develop a strategy that puts us back into driving an agenda and ultimately getting us towards a more peaceful and stable world.
That's great. And you had done some previous work. I wanted to dive deeper into scenario planning, but many of us are exploring generative AI to complement our work and how we drive. It really is amazing. There's always the human element. I look at it as a collaborative partner, and it definitely, to me, powers the processes and the activities we do. You had done some early work with Claude and generative AI and some scenario models, and you also put out an HBR article, and I'll put a link in the description so people can find the article. It's really fascinating. I've been doing a lot of similar work, and I found what you all did. Could you walk the listeners through where kind of the idea sparked, how you went through the process? So for those that don't know, it's like use some private data, some other data sources in addition to the Claude API to create your own scenario LLM, if you will, or environment LLM or environment RAG to do that. If you could, I would love to hear more about how.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a really fun collaborative project that was done with some brilliant colleagues of mine who were already working in this space. And we had all been approaching this issue of generative AI and scenario development from different angles. Mm-hmm. So we just thought, hey, how about we try to combine our collective efforts here and see what comes out of this. And so, to be honest, it was, I think, about a year long back and forth, just trying to figure out what are we going to look at? How are we going to model this? And ultimately, do we have something useful to say beyond obviously all the buzz that's out there surrounding generative AI, right? So what we wanted to do was differentiate and cut through just the buzzwords and actually get to some substance and give people something useful that they could actually put to work in their own businesses or their own organizations. So we went back and forth for about a year thinking through how can we show the utility of generative AI and scenario planning or scenario development. And why scenario development? Because that's really where I think people use futures thinking the most, is communicating a narrative, right? Telling a story, and it cuts through some of just the quantitative stuff and gives people a clear picture of what's happening. So we were able to do that. And we said, okay, let's pick a broader framework about how to do this. And so I thought about trying to put together what's called a cognitive operating system. So very much like the operating system that's already on our computer, right? The interface between the actual, right, the system hardware and the user and the software, something that's regulating it. We tried to put it into that and that kind of conceptual model. We moved out on that, and we used a notional company that we basically created. So the HBR article actually came about as the result of a collaboration between three brilliant colleagues of mine who had been working in this space. Each one of us had a little different approach, right? So we had folks that were in the private sector, some who were in the academic world, some who were in the defense industry. And then at the time, I was in the intelligence community. So I think it was a really great authorship, a powerful authorship. So the article, the intent was to cut through some of the noise and just the buzz of generative AI and give people something useful. So what we said was, look, scenario development, scenario planning is one of the bigger outcomes that people use Foresight for. So how can we use generative AI to not only build a scenario or build a narrative for us? How can we maybe even simulate a contingency exercise where people in their own jobs or organizations? So what we ended up doing was simulating this contingency exercise at a fictional company that we essentially made up. And this was a global consumer electronics manufacturing that had a worldwide supply chain. So we were trying to pick something that was relatable to most people. So what we ended up doing was identifying some of the key resources, external forces that affected the company's business. And then what we did was use the tool to categorize the trends that would affect the company's business and clients and operating environment. And then, for example, give us some estimated probabilities of the occurring impact of these items. And then what we did is we instructed the system after to create a narrative scenario that would give us a richness to our original baseline data so that we could flesh out the nuances of the scenario. So, for example, here it gave us a title called Smart Future AI and Electronics Manufacturing, so that it started talking about financial implications, the kinds of upgrades the company would need to make. And then also we asked to give us an appropriate strategy that was going to be based on the narrative that we create. People can dive into the article to get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty and see how we actually work this. But I think the bottom line is that this really can help simplify decision making for us. And it can really help to evaluate strategies because there's lots of pattern recognition. There's lots of identifying either anomalies that we hadn't thought of or just giving us a really full, comprehensive sense of the contingency planning process. So I think there's a lot of utility for people who want to use these tools, but maybe don't know how to jump in. So I would reference this article as I think a good primer if you're interested in doing that. And we were really pleased because HBR came out and published it last month in the print edition, which was just a great development for us.
Yeah, I know a lot of leaders will read this. So if you were to be able to add your voice to the article itself for leaders listening to this, and many do, like how do they navigate complexities with an uncertain future in mind? How can they use this? Like, how do they integrate Foresight into their strategic planning? How do you counsel clients and how could they learn from this?
So obviously, number one, they've got to do some homework, right? You've got to familiarize yourselves with these tools. And that's sometimes the barrier for entry because people are already overwhelmed in their jobs. And that's usually a barrier to futures thinking or foresight in the first place. But we really can't afford not to take this kind of holistic view. I would say with regard to AI, the capabilities that it can bring to the contingency planning process as we demonstrated in the article really just helps companies, it helps firms explore a very wide range, variety of scenarios. It can also generate, I think, probably more scenarios and maybe even strategic factors than we as individuals might be able to. So that's a useful element of generative AI in this space. I think that at the same time, we want that human factor grounding us in the analysis because some of the more strategic outcomes, and this was a weakness of some of the LLMs that we used, was that their strategies that they developed for us were sometimes thin. They weren't super comprehensive in scope. They tend to focus in on one area, and we were looking at the broader picture. So again, I think this is going to improve as the models are further developed. And I think the utility is getting to that sweet spot of employing the technology with a team that can really fire for effect best.
How do you feel that incorporating ethical considerations? Because many of the ethics of AI is not at the forefront yet. It's okay right now, but it very much reminds me of the openness of social media and the I would say, utopian dreams of what it could be to connect others, that it's become quite a toxic mess now because it wasn't, and I'm not one for regulation, but at least it didn't have more of the oversight. And I do wonder, what do you think ethically should be considered when leaders are mindful, when they're planning for the future and using this type of work, especially in your space of defense and the security space?
Look, you pointed out, I think very rightly, what happened with social media, which if you look back to, let's say, 2008, 2009, 2010, how social media was going to be used, this actually was a weak signal. We want to put it into futures parlance. We are, right? So where we are today with AI, I think is where we were with aviation, probably like in the early 20th century. Right? We're just scratching the surface,
right,
on where we're going to go with this. From an ethical perspective, a lot of the same issues, disinformation, we're populating these tools with data sets, right? So we're inputting data. Who gets to control the data inputs? whose perspectives are listened to. All these kinds of issues are going to be palpable as we move forward. So I think as we're developing the technology and using it, it's who is going to own the data, which is, I think, the currency of our time. There's no question. And how are they going to be using it? And you can't regulate everything away, right? You can't, I would say, rather pessimistically, I think that a lot of the issues we dealt with social media are going to still be present as we move forward with AI. So I think it's a combination of education, sound policy, and frankly, some trial and error.
This leads me into a new book, which is coming out next spring, The Revenge of Ideology. Yeah. We think about the polarization. I know we have a fairly large international audience, but here in the United States, we have definitely, and you're seeing it in Europe too, is a real divide between, and there's a lot of people have based their whole worldviews, their whole living styles on that. All of this, your work has read, it's a fascinating topic. Could you share what the book's about? What inspired you to write all of this?
Sure. I'll try to make this quick because there's a lot to it. But
we're going to have some more time in another podcast to dive deeper into this book. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I would look forward to doing that. So I think the short version of the book is basically, this has been a project I've been working on now for 5 years. So I'm really excited to be done with it, to be very honest. But the idea is looking at ideology itself is actually bigger than just something that's floating around. It's asking a question about, is there something called ideological power actually forces states to do things, right? Sometimes even distorting their ideas of what their own self-interest is. So you could almost say that the book looks at why countries do stupid things. I try to look at ideology and reconceptualize it. Instead of something that's floating around in the air, I say it's actually a living, breathing network. And so I call these ideological power networks. And these things are basically complex adaptive systems within a state. And you got things like the general population of a country and its socio-political elites and what I call the state's control apparatuses. So the army, the police, the educational system, the media, all these things together. These networks are living, breathing organisms that actually generate a profound influence on how countries make decisions. And in some cases, and in many cases, I look at China, look at Russia, Turkey as three core examples of this, and how ideological models over the last 10 to 15 years in each of these countries actually is driving their foreign policy actions, and in many cases, pushing them towards, I think, poor strategic decision-making that's going to have major implications for the United States, but also just for the international order writ large and for the future.
So with thinking about that, where does the field of futures and foresight go within the defense space? It's obviously had a storied past, and you're saying if you could get into these countries and give them, like, they could use this, how would you see it being used looking forward?
Yeah, I think futures and foresight is probably more important today than it has ever been, based on the level of complexity that we're faced with in the world today. And I mean that from a systems thinking point of view, from all of the multifaceted challenges that we have to deal with today. The fact that we have individuals that can transmit narrative warfare as one person, as an individual across the world. That's never happened in human history. That's going to complicate governments' approaches to dealing with this. And it's going to, I think, be a further source of conflict and tension moving forward. We're seeing it's okay again to use military force to solve problems. Just look at what's happening. Look at Ukraine, look at Gaza, look at conflicts happening in Africa, look at the footprint. I think if we're not careful, what we're marching towards with the US and China's strategic competition, we got to place foresight at the center of our strategic approach as the United States to redefine what American deterrence is going to be in the 21st century, but also to create more opportunities, perhaps even a new grand bargain for the 21st century. I think if we're going to go back to that American strategic thinking at its core, we've got to start with an approach that takes into account the world in which we live today. And frankly, just too many of our policymakers are stuck in a world that doesn't exist anymore.
When we have many people entering the field, as we've talked about, yeah, you're right. 10, 15 years ago, it would have been me and 500 other people that if you looked up futurists, right? Now there's, I think, tens of thousands, whether they are practicing or they just like the name. I don't know, but there's a lot more. In a good way, there's more people that are futures aware. The question is, we need to make them future fluent and really adding to helping their respective fields, not just using it as a moniker. Those who are starting, this is about kind of career question. We've all got if I were to be 20 again, what would I tell my 22? But it is also an opportunity. What have you learned from this amazing career in the Air Force, now in the private sector, and really being on the front, the tip of the spear in terms of this field and foresight? What would you wish you knew when you started all of this? What would you know? What would you wish you could tell yourself?
I think, Steve, when I would tell somebody that's looking at getting into this field first is you've got to develop some deep expertise somewhere.
Right.
I think this is something we're not seeing enough of. And I think more people need to talk about it. And I think we've got an obligation to inform this next generation who's coming up to develop some deep expertise somewhere, whether that's technology, whether that's economics, whether that's the scientific discipline, whether that's geopolitics, international relations, right? Develop some deep expertise so that you're able to bring that to the table. And then you're going to see that Foresight Futures really is the icing on the cake. It's going to take your knowledge and it's going to transform it in a compelling way and let you have this anticipatory mindset builds on your existing knowledge. I think that's the most important thing. For me, when I was, getting into this initially, I always kept trying to relate it back to, okay, how can I use this specifically for this task? Maybe now, as I'm hopefully a little bit older and wiser, I think not necessarily having to force it into a particular job function, but as a broader thought exercise, as a way of thinking and expanding my world, I think that would have been a different type of approach, right? I think I kept trying to bring it back to a practical application, which is not a bad thing at all. And ultimately, that's what most people want from this. But I think I was very fortunate to be able to have some dedicated time as a research fellow at the Manoa Center for Futures Studies to really get into the discipline from an academic perspective and then combine the experience I had in national security and intelligence. And I think that set me up later on to be able to develop the Academic Research Center for the intelligence community and also work to create the Air Force's Foresight team at the Pentagon and hopefully change some of that cultural mindset of how we do strategic planning.
That kind of comes to our kind of closing question is I always like to ask the legacy question. How do you want, looking back, say if now you're looking 20 years in this field and your work, how do you want it to be remembered? What impact do you hope it has on the world?
Well, look, I think the greatest gift, the greatest satisfaction that somebody could have really is just recognizing that maybe, hey, this guy made us think. This guy made us questions. He questioned the status quo and gave us a framework to try to understand a lot of these complex issues in a different way. I think if it's as simple as that, are you helping expand the body of knowledge? And hopefully you're passing along this way of thinking so that you're making a network that really can have impact, and not just for national security, across the board, across all industries and all sectors, because I really feel that that's the beauty of Foresight, is that it's a really universally applicable discipline that frankly anybody can get into. That would be my hope moving forward.
That's great. So how can people find you? You're prolific on LinkedIn, so they definitely should find you there. So how can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn for sure. They can also take a look at my website, www.jakesotiriadis.com, where I've got all my articles, updates. If they want to book me as a speaker, if they want to see what I'm working on, everything there, that's the hub to connect.
That's great. Thanks for the time today. And it was great to have you on, and we'll have you back very soon. Thanks a lot, Jake.
This was fun. Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Think Forward podcast. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms and at www thinkforwardshow.com as well as on YouTube under Think Forward Show. See you next time.